Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, which was named by poets and writers a best book for writers. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. And follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Hi, everybody. It's Estelle Erasmus, and I'm so happy to be introducing Hannah Sward. And let me tell you a little bit about her. She's the daughter of the late poet Robert Sward, and she's the IAN award-winning author of Strip, a memoir. It's her first book, and it has received the attention of authors such as Nobel Prize winner J.M. Coetzee, Melissa Broder, and New York Times bestselling novelist Caroline Leavitt, who called Sward one of the most moving and honest memoir writers. So eloquent, so brave. Sward has spoken on dozens of podcasts and panels, with special appearances on NBC, CA Live, and C-SPAN BookTV. Published in literary journals for the past 20 years, she was a regular contributor at the Fix and Erotic review. Her most recent work can be read in the LA Times, New York Times, Tiny Love Story, Huff Post, the Rumpus, and others. Sward is on the board at Right to Write Press, a nonprofit that supports emerging incarcerated writers. She lives in Los Angeles, where she is working on a short story collection about love and jealousy. So maybe you could do a little nutshell, talk about what your book is before we get into the nitty gritty.
Stell, thank you so much. As you know, I've been a fan of you and your podcast, and more recently, your book, which I highly suggest to everyone. It's become my Bible. So, with my book, Strip, as Estelle said, it is a memoir. It covers a big span of time from the time I'm born until my late 30s.
You were abandoned by your mother. You were living with your father. He's a poet. He had many women in his life. There was abuse in your life, not from your father, but from kind of his lack of watching over you. Things happen as they do with kids. And I understand that because I've always been so vigilant on my daughter as she was growing up, because I knew the things that could happen to kids.
Yeah.
And so then you ended up spiraling into addiction. So can you talk a little bit about how the loneliness and the abandonment, your mother kind of just left you with your dad and went off, I believe, to Florida, right?
That's right. Yes, Florida. You know what? I think of it in terms of abandoning myself. And it was like I mimicked that. I mean, I feel like I abandoned myself from a very young age. I didn't have a center. And I played that out in my own way later. And I think that really stemmed from that loneliness of not having that mirror of a parent in a way. So the loneliness definitely started in childhood. I remember being, very young and just being under the bleachers at school, the hiding. And later, what that looked like with my addiction is that was a hiding. I mean, and that comes to the title strip, which is, beyond stripping. That isolation, it wasn't comfortable, but it was more comfortable than not, than being in a social situation. And again, what that looked like in my addiction is that hiding from myself, from others, and internally and then also physically. I was a real bathroom girl. Yeah, I hate to brag, but I know all the good bathrooms from the east side to the west side of Los Angeles. Yeah, I was very drawn to clothing myself off, even though it's ironic. I mean, there's one chapter which is stripping, and that's not hiding, but it is.
So you ended up becoming a stripper, and it
Yeah.
was a way to make money. You formed a sort of community. Later, your sister joined you in it, and you learned kind of extreme behaviors there, right? You learned dieting, tips and tricks. You're not advocating for anybody, but again, it was part of that lifestyle. And that also led you then to sex work. And again, the commodity is your beauty. Nobody cares that you can put pen to paper and write a story. It's how you look. But for me, when I'm reading your book, a lot of that was representative of how your mom and the men in her life kind of circled around her for her beauty.
Yeah.
And that was her value. She would have periods of being very upset when a man wasn't involved. And so when you talk about not having a model, you kind of had that other kind of distancing model.
Yeah, that's such a great observation and insight. Absolutely.
And so when you're starting to find yourself, I mean, it's really the story of your journey to finding yourself. And what I like about it is that you don't end in a place like, and now I'm good and everything's fine. And we're wrapping it up in a bow and we're leaving. It's like you're ending where we know that you're realizing you have more value than
Yeah.
just the external. And that's kind of a stripping away as well.
Yeah, you nailed it. And that's exactly it, Estelle. Yeah.
So talk about the writing and how that started getting you to blossom.
Yeah. Well, that's my favorite thing to talk about is writing. It always has been. When I got sober, which was again, in my later 30s, it's been one of the biggest gifts in my life. The book would not be here. I would not be here if I was not sober. With that, when I got sober, one of the things that really terrorized me was that I was not doing what I knew I needed to be doing, which was writing. And I was writing on and off throughout my addiction. And I had gone back to college to get my degree somehow during my addiction. And so my greatest desire and my greatest fear was that I wasn't going to write when I got sober. So it was really getting pen to paper. I had no idea of the book. In fact, I never wanted to write a book. Short stories has always been my thing. And I was not thinking about publishing in the beginning. However, the universe put this incredible mentor in my life, Jill Sherry Robinson, who passed away recently. And she studied under Helen Gurley Brown. And she ended up being my mentor. And I met her at CD Library in Hollywood. And she was the teacher. And that same day when I read in that group, which was a very eclectic group of people, she came up to me and she said, "You're coming to my home with me." And she took me under her wing. She said, "You're writing a memoir." And she was feisty. And I said, "Well, I'm just not." And we went back and forth. And that really started my journey. That's how the book began. But I certainly fought it. And all along I was writing. However, I just didn't necessarily see it as a memoir.
Interesting. And your chapters are very short. So when you said to me that you had this background in writing short stories, that makes a lot of sense now. You kind of used a similar structure to a short story with writing each chapter. Can you talk a little bit about that structuring?
Yes, I think in part because I grew up with my poet father and always around poetry. I'm not a poet, but the short story lends itself in a way to poetry, right? And especially the way this book is written with, I think there's 72 chapters, which is a lot in 250 pages. But I liked that conciseness. And I was also thinking when I was writing it in the drafts, that I wanted it to be clipped along so people who don't necessarily read could pick it up and just come to a chapter and dive in. Because I really love to go to the bookstore, the library, and pick up a book wherever. And just like with poetry, I don't always read the whole poem, but I'll skip around. So I wanted it to, lend itself to clips, little vignettes, However, what's interesting, Estelle, is that when I was writing it, it was the opposite. It was one long sentence, like 300 pages of and there was no punctuation. It was just this breathlessness of getting it out. Because when I did begin writing it without even knowing that's what I was writing, my goal was you're writing 2 pages a day, handwritten, no matter what. It didn't matter what it was. And so every day, that's what I did. And it was so uncomfortable that a lot of the times I just stood up and wrote it because I just wanted to be done with my 2 pages. A lot of it was done in that, like almost like a child's, like, like that.
You had to get it out. I mean, it's so interesting to me because you dealt with addiction,
Yeah.
and addiction can impact memory. It can
Yeah.
impact all sorts of functions, but yet you were able to excavate all these childhood memories and
Yeah.
situations. And how did that happen? Was that part of that getting it out, and so
Mhm.
then it came out? Or was there some other process? I'm always fascinated by process.
Oh, me too. With this, I actually started in adulthood. That's what I was writing first. And then Jill, my mentor, said, "You need to write about childhood." And I was just like, no, no, I'm just not doing that. I have no interest. I don't want to go there. However, I did. And I think one, I've always kept a journal from what I can remember my whole life. And even though it's not like I can remember those entries, I think the very act of putting that pen to paper somehow integrates it into myself. So it's like I had this access that I didn't know I had. And of course, a lot of those things, like, for example, orange boots. People are like, "How did you know you had orange boots?" For example, that one I saw a picture. So sometimes pictures would really help. I also really drew from my father's poetry because it brought me back to a feeling. And once I could access that feeling, it brought me there.
That's really interesting. Let's break that down. So, to
Yeah.
me, I've heard about photos before, and that's true. That will bring forth a moment in time. You could see
Yeah.
the setting, you could see what you were wearing, all that. Now, your father's poetry, that's really interesting.
Yes, I mean, I remember he wrote one of his books, Lasqueti Island, called Honey Bear, and there's a brief little section about it when we're living, him and I, on a houseboat on Lasqueti Island off of Victoria in the Victoria Islands in British Columbia, and it's called Honey Bear, and in the poem, it brings me to that dock that we were on. So even if it's one line, oh, it's like all we need, right? And I think it's Anne Lamott that talks about that, like that window. So even if I have that one line of a poem sitting on the dock, I'm like, "Oh, I can access it from there."
That's so interesting, Hannah. So, like, I'm working on memoir, and
Yes.
I've thought of like using different diary things from when I was younger, but
Yeah.
also if I could maybe access things that my parents were doing at the time, maybe
Yeah.
something from my dad's work. I don't know if that's even possible to access, but it's making me think that that's another window in to the world that you're trying to seek when you're going into childhood.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's so many ways, and I don't even know how conscious I was of it. It wasn't like I went to his poetry looking for that part of me over the years that I wasn't aware of even, but it was just this constant poetry, poetry.
So you talk very frankly about difficult topics. And
Yeah.
how was that for you, that process of just being as open and honest as you could? Did you have in mind the reader and thinking maybe she would be a troubled woman like you were, or a
Mhm.
troubled young girl? Or what was your thinking at the moment?
I hear people say they wrote a book to help people, and I really didn't. Like, I mean, that sounds wrong, but I was not thinking about the audience. However, I was thinking about my mother and my father. I was thinking about them. That was the top of my head. I think one, being in recovery and having that practice of sharing my story, that was just a part of it. And then also, before I started writing the book, I started writing for a recovery magazine called The Fix. And that helped me become comfortable. For example, I had pitched them, and the first pitch was Sugar Daddies in and Out of Sobriety. I'm like, I haven't read that. I'd really like to read that. And these were also pieces I was going to write anyway. So I only pitched things that I wanted to write. And they responded well to that. And so it's like I had that practice of putting it out there, hearing the response. I had been so riddled with shame for so many years. And going back to the beginning of the podcast, when you talked about the loneliness and the isolation, keeping that all in here was killing me. It was really killing me. And I still struggle with that at times, depending on where I'm at spiritually in myself, if I'm in a vulnerable place, or sometimes depending on who it is I'm talking to, right? But sharing that, it just felt like if I'm not going to write the truth, don't write it.
I always say something to my students. It's like when you unleash something into the world, be prepared for the world to unleash back on you. You have written about your dad. I mean, he wasn't as focused on you as he should have been in childhood. Let's face it.
Right.
Your mom, I mean, you basically start with, she left you and went off to her man or man at the time. But now you have a relationship with your mom. That's how you kind of end the book. Like she's more of a mother to you, probably because she has security and stability in a relationship with Peter, I think it is. So it's almost like, how are they reacting to you being so open and honest about them? And what about Ricardo? And what about,
Yeah. With my mother, before it came out, I sat her down and I said, Mom, I'm scared of this book coming out because my intention is not to hurt you with this. I wrote it for myself and to get this story out. And her response was, do you think your father didn't write about me? And also, it would take 7 books to write about my men, not one, But I also knew like she wasn't really hearing me.
Right.
It was
dramatic. It was like, I'm the star. Of course, that would be written about me.
Yeah. And the truth is, once it's come out, it hasn't gone well with her. And that is not a surprise. I was disappointed and it makes me sad. And that has been a struggle. However, at one point, a year into it, I said, I'm done. I'm not talking about the book anymore with you. And when she does bring it up, I redirect it. I was open to conversations in the beginning, but it wasn't a conversation.
It was an attack.
Yeah. Yeah. And not about the book itself. Well, the book itself, but that first line she couldn't get over. Born in the Bohemian 70s, Hannah Sward was abandoned by her mother. And right there was no discussion of any other part of the book. Although she did say she didn't know about the kidnapping.
She didn't know about the man in the brown car and that kind of
stuff. She didn't know any of that.
But again, as a parent, I believe a parent has a responsibility, especially when the child is vulnerable and young, of being vigilant, because who else is going to be vigilant?
Yes. And just the fact that she can't get beyond that first sentence. There's other things in the book.
That's sad for her, but she needs to, at the very least, acknowledge your ability to put words on paper in a beautiful way.
She is, but not this book.
I understand that. And what about your dad, the poet?
The poet, when I was writing this all along, it's just like, I really want to read it. Sometimes I would send him my work. Sometimes I wouldn't, but I wouldn't send him parts of the book. I just said, Dad, it's off limits for you. He's like, if you ever get a copy at the library or the bookstore, I'm going to be ripping out a lot of it. And so I was very honest about that. And, he knew about parts of my life for sure. And he was worried about it. He was worried about his reputation, worried about what I was going to say about him. I remember publishing one piece that I was actually a friend of his from a college in Santa Cruz that had published one of my pieces. And it did that. He was really, really upset about that, as if it was an attack on him. And he was always incredibly supportive. Both of my parents, incredibly supportive of my writing. I mean, I'm very fortunate in that way, but there's the mixed messages, right?
Hannah, what about your sister? How did she feel being part of it?
She's very similar to myself. Yeah, probably my biggest fan.
Now, what about Ricardo? Are you still in touch with Ricardo or no?
I love that you ask about him. We actually do. We do still text. I haven't seen him since we broke up, but we are on good terms. And I always say happy birthday. His mom died recently, who I adored and loved and definitely reached out. So we were on good terms. There was a period though where it was, we needed to have our distance.
Yeah. When you
Uh,
moved out, you said you still loved each other. And, me, my fantasy life, I think, oh, if it was a rom-com movie, he'd be getting his act together. He'd be getting a job that would be more to your, standard. And
a job, period. I mean, he was delivering flowers. And that's the other thing about the book. Of course, you would read it, but I mean, I've done podcasts where they haven't read it and they'll be like, well, what was it like to step down from that high lifestyle of being a call girl? My high lifestyle, it was a studio apartment with a hot plate for 9 years.
eating ramen noodles and
Exactly. I mean, I wasn't the most talented. Yeah. It's
well, you had those moments with, Omar, and I know I'm like citing your book, like,
I love it. I just love it. It's so wonderful. I mean, it's
the Orthodox man also. I mean, they, seemed caring towards you at least, even more so than the customers when you were in the strip club. It was a longer term implication, but yet you cut that off. I guess it was the value part of yourself and also the addiction part when you were starting to realize the recovery aspect. You were like, I have to cut all this off. If I'm going to go back to ramen noodles on a hot plate, that's what it'll have to be. Making that decision takes tremendous fortitude and resilience. And it must have been in there with you because you can't access something you don't have.
right. Yeah, it was very scary. And towards the end, Omar, which was, for those listening, he was my last sugar daddy, was a very nice man. And he was giving me 200 a month because I wasn't sleeping with him. He would just take me to Trader Joe's and I'd get like $100 worth of food, which I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Put it in my little, fridge, which was like just one of those little student fridges. But that 200 helped towards my rent. So to say no to that at the end, and again, we were not having sex, was very hard, especially because he was not demanding anything in return, but there's always something in return, right? For me, there was always a cost.
To me, the 20s are a girl's time, young woman's time to experiment. It was because you didn't value yourself because of your upbringing. You did more than just what a girl would do or a young woman experimenting, trying different things. It was like you were looking. Where do I fit? Where can I go? I value myself more now than I did in my 20s. And I could just imagine, like, if you don't have that stability, it's very easy to veer off into the wrong path. And very few people come back from it like you did.
I'm blessed. I have had so many opportunities with my community, with inner resources, wherever those came from, to come out of that. And it's a continuous coming out of, right? I've been very fortunate because you're absolutely right. People don't return from it. Many don't.
So, what do you feel that you, as a writer, as a member of the literary community, as somebody who teaches other people, what do you feel that your very different experiences than most people help you bring to the surface in your work?
I think an immediacy, a rawness, honesty. I think honesty and vulnerability and the shame has held me back for so long and the self-hatred that it's really important to talk about. It was the women that have come before me and that continue to share those parts of themselves that they never, ever wanted to share with someone. That has helped me. That's helped me feel seen. And when I'm writing my truth, I have the opportunity to be seen and to be heard. That's why you reading the book, it's like, wow, right? That someone chooses to sit with my truth and my words. And maybe, as I've heard from quite a number of women that's reached out, can share something with me and can also access that, whether they're writers or not, it's not so important. And also, I'm so blessed that I have a community that creates that space for it. Right. I've lived in that place of not truth, of lying, of hiding for so long. And it's like, I'm going to share what that was like. I don't want to make it sound like that's just it. I say the truth and that's it. No, I have women that help me to say the truth, because I don't always want to. I mean, one great example is with Jill, that my mentor. I remember bringing her pages once because she became my editor as well. I brought her pages. I read them out loud. It was in a hotel room. That's in the book. And she said something's missing. I couldn't believe it. I could not believe she knew something was missing because it's a very raw scene. And I just looked at her and she's like, was 83 at the time. I'm like, how do you know? And she's like, go home and write it. And I did. And I brought it back and she's like, there it is. And I did not want to write that. I was not going to tell anyone that. I was so ashamed and I wrote it.
Which scene?
It's in the Peninsula Hotel with a man that was in the hot tub with.
The celebrity. The celebrity.
Yeah. But I was very ashamed. So she knew that, but she held space for that. And then once I wrote it, okay, here it is.
Yeah. And it really resonates because you give clues to the character and people now know and be like, oh, that makes perfect sense in light of what we know without giving everything away. What's next for you?
Well, I'm working on a short story collection, which I've been working on for many years, but I'm compiling them. And as I go back, many of the stories were published since my 20s, and I'm finding they're not holding up to my standards now. So it's taking a lot longer with the short story collection than I thought. So I'm doing a short story collection, very different from the book, about love, jealousy, and affairs. And that's what I'm doing. And I think, too, this is one of the things I loved about your book. Newspapers and big outlets were not on my radar ever. I just didn't really consider it. Even though I was reading them, it just wasn't on my radar. And so in the past year, when I was getting back into more away from the promotion of the book and back to my own writing, I remember taking one to my writers group and they're like, where's this going? I said, oh, I don't know. And they're like, send it to the Times. I'm like, the Times? They're not going to publish a story like this. Like, are you insane? And so that's been really fun. But right now, the short story collection. Yeah. What are you working on? Oh, your memoir, a memoir.
My memoir. Yeah. Memoir, being in magazines in the 90s and early oats and being the dating diva while looking for love.
Yes. Yes. And that's the other thing. I think I wrote this in the review of your book, but like, I just love the concrete examples of that when you were, drawing from your students and your experiences and the concrete examples.
Thank you so much. Is there anything I didn't ask you, Hannah, that you would like to share about your book, about your process?
Well, people still ask, and I think it was Joanne. There's a writer that wrote about it recently or had posted something about it, but about the power of pen to paper, actual pen to paper. And I'm a big advocate of that because I really feel like it frees something. I mean, and that's how I wrote the first draft of my whole book was by hand.
Just on paper, just with your pen? Wow.
Yeah. Well, they're not around anymore, but the dollar store journals, that, and I like it. I like those too because I feel like, oh, I don't have to write well in them because they're 99 cents.
And then you just type it over later, or is it?
Yes. And I think there's something really wonderful that happens in the transcribing.
Yeah, somebody I had talked to, I think it was Jen Rakoff, she said that
That's who it was.
she uses like lined pads. So I bought a bunch of lined pads, but I haven't used them, but maybe I will.
Yeah. So I don't know where that came from. It just kind of popped into my head. Yeah, no, I just want to say thank you for everything that you bring to the community. Again, for having me on. It's such an honor to talk with you. I really admire you and look up to you. So
Thank you so much. Well, I am so glad we're able to talk about Strip, and I'm going to give a link where people can buy your book. The blurb on the cover says, arresting, weighty, and visceral as hell, a crushing tale of physical, emotional, and spiritual survival by Melissa Broder, author of Milk Fed. And it really sums up the kind of wave, the tsunami of transformation that is in your book. Thank you so much. This was great speaking with you.
Thank you, Estelle. Thank you.
Follow me at EstelleSErasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.